Keith Raniere, born on August 26, 1960, described himself as an ethicist whose ethical teachings have focused on raising the level of humanity within each person. But his actions tell a different story. Keith has a troubling history of violence, having physically assaulted at least 2 of his intimate partners. In 2012, he encouraged a woman to run headfirst into a tree, and even to drink from a puddle. He also has a long and troubling history involving interactions with women and girls that spans several decades. Confidential sources reveal that throughout the mid to late 1980s and into the early 1990s, he had numerous sexual encounters with various teenage girls. In one disturbing instance, he met a 12-year-old girl whose mother was employed by him. He started tutoring her, and soon after he began having regular intercourse with her, including at his home, where he lived with several adult sexual partners. One of these adults even hired the girl to walk her dog, which gave Keith daily access to the girl. Alarmingly, he once expressed that he thought the age of consent laws were too strict, suggesting the age of consent should be lowered to when a parent decides that the child is capable of consent. In addition to creating a disturbing cult, which we'll explore in detail throughout this video, there have also been multiple suspicious deaths linked to Keith. We will detail some of those deaths toward the end of the video. Around 1998, Keith and Nancy Salzman founded Executive Success Programs, a human potential school designed to help individuals achieve personal growth and reach their goals. ESP offered a series of workshops to help participants maximize their potential. Nancy was the CEO of the company and was seen as the head of education, while Keith served as the philosophical leader whose ideas were central to the organization's philosophy. She worked with Keith to develop educational models based on his philosophical ideas, which she then taught to the members. The executive board of ESP met regularly and were responsible for overseeing all activities within the company. However, they did not have the authority to make final decisions on policy changes, but could suggest them. Any changes had to be confirmed by Keith, who held the ultimate authority over policy decisions. In the early 2000s, Keith and Nancy had also founded an organization called NXIVM, which became the umbrella organization for ESP, and a variety of other programs and entities developed by Keith and Nancy. At its peak, the organization had around 700 members, which included wealthy individuals and even some celebrities. NXIVM initially presented itself as an executive counseling organization, describing itself on its official website as a professional business providing educational tools, coaching and trainings to corporations and people from all walks of life. NXIVM's headquarters was in Albany, New York, but the organization had centers throughout the Americas, including the United States, Canada, Central America, and Mexico. NXIVM's Mexican programs were specifically designed for wealthy individuals, more so than any other center within the organization. The participants in these programs came from extremely affluent and prestigious backgrounds, including children of former presidents and executives from large corporations and media companies. Many of the NXIVM members, or Nexians, including Keith, lived near the headquarters in Clifton Park, about 20 miles outside Albany. The organization's dedicated group of followers fully embraced Keith's teachings and the principles of NXIVM. Keith was called Vanguard, and Nancy was referred to as Prefect, and members were required to address them using these titles. Within NXIVM, Keith was regarded as a revered figure and was almost seen as a king or spiritual leader within the community. According to various sources, including former high-ranking members, Keith's word is considered absolute within the organization. Nothing of significance happens without his approval. NXIVM students are also taught to believe that Keith is the smartest and most ethical man in the world. He even compared himself to famous figures like Einstein and Gandhi. Keith was presented as one of the top 3 problem solvers in the world, had one of the highest IQs ever recorded, was a concert-level pianist, a judo champion, and an incredible human being. He was also described as someone who has unlocked the keys to the human condition. Keith emphasized his intellect, saying that he had majors in mathematics, physics, and computer science, and had minors in psychology and biology. He often claimed to have earned 3 degrees from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, but a closer look at his academic record reveals that he graduated with a GPA of 2.26 and he either failed or barely passed in many of the advanced math and science courses he bragged about taking. Keith attracted a wide range of followers, including a millionaire heiress and TV actresses who trusted him, believing he had valuable teachings to offer. However, he manipulated that trust for his own selfish desires, seeking control, power, and satisfaction at the expense of those around him. NXIVM operated in secrecy, with members often required to sign non-disclosure agreements and make promises not to share certain details about the organization's teachings. The workshops and classes offered by Keith's entities promised personal and professional growth. Some of the workshops and classes were very expensive, some even costing up to $5,000 for a 5-day session. Many NXIVMs ended up in significant debt, and some even took jobs within NXIVM to pay off their growing debts. Because the courses were so costly, there was pressure to continue taking them. They ended up accruing even more debt and remained obliged to NXIVM. Participants were encouraged to keep coming back for more courses and to recruit others to join, with the promise of advancing in the ranks. Members must achieve certain ranks before they can start earning salaries or commissions, and as they move up, they gain more responsibilities and privileges. NXIVM members are told they can get rich by rising through the ranks, but in reality, only a small number of them ever make significant money, while many end up deep in debt to the organization. Its structure basically had the characteristics of a multi-level marketing scheme, or pyramid scheme. Before founding ESP, Keith had actually been investigated for running a pyramid scheme called Consumers Byline. In 1996, as part of a consent order with the New York State Attorney General's office, he was prohibited from operating any multi-level marketing schemes in New York again. And in 1997, just a year before launching ESP, the company was forced to shut down after a settlement with the New York Attorney General. In terms of the ESP rank system, Keith held the highest rank, followed by Nancy Salzman. Both Keith and Nancy were outside the formal ranking system because they had created it. As members move up, they receive different colored sashes for each level. The next highest rank was that of senior counselors, and individuals holding this rank wore purple sashes. The counselors wore blue sashes, and senior proctors wore green sashes. Below them were the proctors who wore orange sashes, and then the coaches who wore yellow sashes. They also had specific rules for handshakes based on rank. During the handshake, the person of higher rank would place their hand on top, and the lower ranked person would have their hand underneath. Every year in August, NXIVM members gathered in Silver Bay, New York, to celebrate Vanguard Week, or V-Week, in honor of Keith's birthday, and people from different centers would come together to celebrate. Preparing for Vanguard Week took considerable time, with some of the preparations taking several months. The 10-day celebration often included multiple birthday cakes for the attendees, performances by singers, tribute ceremonies, and a forum where Keith would speak to the community and answer their questions. Everything during V-Week was centered around honoring Keith and celebrating his work. The event cost a lot of money to attend. The price for attendance varied depending on the accommodation. The cheapest option, if signed up well in advance, was around $1,400 for rustic accommodations, and the most expensive could reach $3,000 or more. In 2015, Keith, along with several women, including actress Allison Mack, created a secret society within NXIVM known as DOS, also called the Vow. DOS stood for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which roughly translates to Master of the Obedient Female Companions. The vow refers to the vow of obedience that members were expected to make to Keith. In DOS, Keith held titles such as Master, Grand Master, and Supreme Master. This cult included female NXIVM members who were coerced into sexual relationships with Keith, with the expectation that they would be exclusively devoted to him, cutting ties with any other men. Although some members of DOS were also part of NXIVM, the two groups were not officially connected. In fact, Keith preferred to recruit people who were not involved with NXIVM at all, perhaps to avoid suspicion. Since ESP's founding, Keith maintained a rotating group of 15 to 20 women with whom he had sexual relationships. These women were forbidden from having any other sexual relationships and were also prohibited from discussing their relationships with Keith. Keith's teachings even focused on men needing multiple sexual partners while encouraging women to remain monogamous. DOS operated under a strict hierarchy. Keith sat at the top as the Grand Master, with several women acting as both his direct slaves and first-line masters. These women were responsible for recruiting other women into DOS, who were then referred to as slaves. Slaves were required to recruit others to join, and by doing so, they'd become masters themselves, with each new layer of the pyramid owing loyalty and service, not only to their own masters but also to other masters higher up the chain, including Keith, who was the only man in this cult. The first-line masters, who were the only ones who knew about Keith, were forbidden from revealing that he was the ultimate leader of the DOS. While Keith was involved with many of the first-line masters, not all of them had such relationships with him. One of the women who had a relationship with Keith was Lauren Salzman, Nancy's daughter. The structure of DOS was designed to isolate and control its members, making them emotionally and psychologically dependent on Keith, as well as sexually devoted to him. The recruitment process often targeted women who were experiencing difficulties in their lives, including struggling with their roles in NXIVM. While the terms master and slave weren't used in the initial recruitment pitch, recruits were told they had an opportunity to join an exclusive organization that could change their lives. After this, they would be told that in order to learn more about the organization and move forward, they would have to provide collateral. This collateral consisted of sensitive personal information and compromising material, such as explicit photographs, many of which depicted the women undressed or in compromising situations, or videos and letters where the prospective slaves would tell damaging stories and make harmful accusations which were sometimes fabricated about themselves, their friends, or their family. For example, a slave was videotaped multiple times speaking negatively about her family, making false statements such as claiming she only had a relationship with them for her inheritance, and that her husband was abusing her and her son. These videos were made to appear candid, and thus more believable. Additionally, a slave who was married to an attorney had given collateral that could have gotten him fired from his job and disbarred. In some cases, the masters actually helped the recruits come up with what to offer as collateral, and even coached them on what to do or say to make the collateral more harmful. For example, a slave named Sylvie once provided collateral, but Monica Duran, her master, told her that it wasn't strong enough. Monica, who was Keith's direct slave and a first-line master, then suggested to Sylvie that she should write a detailed letter claiming she was a prostitute and address it to her parents, and seal it in a stamped envelope and leave it with her so that she could send the letter to her parents if she disobeyed. Sylvie also wrote a letter to Monica giving her the power over whether she could have children or not. Examples of collateral slaves submitted included a letter written to social services where a slave alleged that she abused her nephews, a sex tape, and a video describing abuse a slave suffered as a child. Additionally, the collateral even included the right to their assets, and a slave once even committed to giving half or a portion of her income to her master. Lauren Salzman, in addition to submitting naked photographs, also gave up everything she owned as collateral, including her finances, investment accounts, 2 homes, 2 cars, and all her art. Another slave submitted a collateral in the form of a contract which stated that the ownership of her home would be transferred to Keith. The collateral was meant to instill fear in the slaves. Fear that this private information could be exposed if they ever tried to leave or speak out about DOS, and that it even existed, which would ensure their loyalty and silence. Keith taught a lesson called Good versus Bad, and a passage in that lesson said, quote, "The strongest bond that we can have as being for the good is a new bond that's created, which is the vow." It was explained that this bond was similar to the criminal bond in organizations like the mafia, where members won't rat or turn on each other because they are afraid of being killed. The collateral in DOS was meant to be so powerful and frightening that it would prevent someone from violating their vow, and the collateral was intended to be stronger than the fear of death. Once the prospective slaves had given up their collateral, they were told that DOS was a women's-only organization, and Keith's role as the highest master would be omitted. The purpose of DOS, according to the masters, was to eradicate weaknesses in its members. They would then be told that they were required to make a lifelong vow of obedience which centered around a strict master-slave dynamic. If anyone hesitated about this or expressed doubts about the terms, the masters would downplay them, saying things like, "All women are slaves to something." The NXIVM curriculum suggested that women had inherent weaknesses, like being over-emotional, not being able to keep promises, and playing the victim, and when the prospective slaves would hesitate to join the organization, the masters would manipulate them into thinking that their hesitation was proof that they needed DOS due to their weaknesses. Allison was very dedicated and had a written vow on her computer. The vow, directed toward Keith, involved a commitment to never leave him, and in the event that she did, she would give up any children she had and all her possessions to him. This vow was described as a lifelong commitment. For those who agreed to join DOS, they would be asked to give up even more collateral, and over time slaves were asked to provide collateral every month. The DOS slaves did what they were told, as they were afraid that the collateral they had already provided would be released if they didn't comply. In essence, they were trapped. Just like NXIVM, DOS operated in secrecy, and slaves would sign NDAs. One NDA stipulated that a slave would have to pay $1 million in damages if she spoke out about the organization, and another part of the agreement transferred the slave's assets to her master. These included a 2017 Toyota Prius, assets and various bank accounts, 3 Vanguard Roth IRA accounts, and personal home furnishings. The NDA also granted the master the right to release the slave's collateral publicly. Additionally, there was a waiver that held the master not liable for any damage the slave might experience during her participation in DOS. There were a lot of practices associated with DOS. For example, every morning and night, members had to check in with their masters, and they were expected to perform acts of care for them, essentially serving them like personal assistants. These acts included tasks like running errands, buying groceries, making meals, cleaning houses, carrying luggage, and finding lost items. This idea of acts of care was part of the broader NXIVM philosophy, which placed high value on learning to care for others without expecting anything in return. In addition to the daily acts of care, members were also given assignments or tasks from their masters that either directly or implicitly required them to have sex with Keith, which they then did. If a member did not complete these tasks to their master's satisfaction, they were often reprimanded, and slaves feared that if they repeatedly failed to meet expectations, then their collateral would be released. Additionally, many members also believed that their success within NXIVM depended on them successfully completing DOS assignments. For example, a few weeks after joining DOS, Sylvie was asked by her master Monica to seduce Keith, which she didn't want to do. However, she felt she had no choice, as the assignment came from her master. Sylvie stalled for a bit, but eventually Monica reminded her that she needed to start the assignment. Sylvie then sent Keith a WhatsApp message, commenting on how he looked hot in his glasses or something similar. Keith responded to the message, and at some point he told her, quote, "You are going to have to do better than that." She found this response strange, because it seemed like he was in on it, and knew what she was trying to do. She was under the impression that DOS was a secret all-women's organization, but his comment made her suspicious. Over the course of the evening, Sylvie was encouraged by Keith to send him photos. It started with a simple picture of her face, but Keith pushed her to become more vulnerable and send increasingly revealing images. He even told her how to pose. While Sylvie didn't want to do this, she felt obligated to follow through with it because this was an assignment her master gave her. She continued sending these photos for what she described as a long time, though she was unsure exactly how many months passed. She described spending a lot of time in private attempting to take these photos in secrecy, which added a great deal of anxiety to her already stressful life. The situation made her feel tense and out of control, especially as she lived with her husband, and she had no idea how far things would go. At some point, her father reached out to her on Facebook, mentioning that she would need to set up her own iCloud account, because he had found medical pictures in the iCloud storage, referring to the explicit images. Sylvie was mortified, and she stopped taking the photos afterwards. Following this, Monica approached her and said that she should not have stopped sending the photos without first getting permission from Keith. Monica instructed Sylvie to ask Keith for permission, and she did as she was told. She explained to Keith that her father had discovered the photos, and after hearing this, he told her that she could stop sending the photos, but she would need to meet him in person. Sylvie was instructed by Monica to ask Keith to take her picture during their meeting, and to go along with whatever happens. Following these instructions, Sylvie walked from her own home to a house on Flintlock Drive, which she believed Keith once shared with one of his lovers, Pamela Caffritz, though it seemed unoccupied at the time. She entered the house with Keith, and he led her to a room with a bed that had somewhat dirty white sheets. At this point, she became increasingly fearful of asking Keith to take her picture. She eventually gathered the courage to ask him, and he agreed to take it. He instructed her to undress and lay on the bed, and he then assaulted her. She felt terrified and overwhelmed, and tried to make it stop as quickly as possible. Since it was a command from her master, and she was a slave, she felt as if she had no choice but to let it happen to avoid getting her collateral released. Keith then took her photo, and afterwards he positioned himself next to her on the bed, and made remarks praising her bravery, calling her special, and telling her that she was now part of the inner circle. Sylvie felt disgusted and angry during the conversation, particularly with the use of the words special and brave, because she felt disgusting and ashamed. He also referred to himself as her grandmaster and Monica's master. Keith told her she now had a special privilege. She could ask him for help with anything. Looking back on her experience, Sylvie said the reality of the situation was much darker and more disturbing than she had expected when she was first introduced to DOS. The masters who gave the slaves these assignments profited off the slaves sleeping with Keith, and were often rewarded with increased status and financial opportunities within the organization. Keith also promised to give the slaves who completed these assignments money and a job. A slave began sleeping with Keith, and once she defected from DOS and stopped sleeping with him, he demanded her to pay the money back. Other assignments involved forced celibacy and grooming the slaves for Keith. For example, Keith is known to prefer women who are extremely thin, and some of the assignments involve the women being instructed to follow a very strict low-calorie diet and to document the food they eat. Many of the women were extremely thin and seemed to have some issue with food, whether it was following specific diets, cleanses, or restricting their calorie intake. For example, Claire Bronfman, who was actually an heir to the Seagram's liquor fortune, was following a raw vegan diet and often talked about how she only needed 800 calories a day. Additionally, there was a practice called the Master Cleanse, which involved drinking a mixture of water, lemon, maple syrup, and cayenne pepper, along with an herbal blend that caused frequent visits to the toilet. Many women participated in the Master Cleanse regularly, and some people did it for about 10 days, but others followed it for different lengths of time. Members were often given other tasks by their masters, which included things like reviewing NXIVM-related materials, or doing work for Keith himself. For example, some members were asked to read and edit articles written by Keith or even transcribe interviews related to NXIVM events. DOS slaves also had to do stuff that would cause them discomfort. For example, they were sometimes required to take cold showers for long periods, do difficult exercises like planks, or stand for an hour at 4 in the morning. Another big part of the DOS program was something called readiness drills. These drills were basically designed to make sure that slaves were always on call at any hour of the day or night. Keith would initiate the drill by sending a question mark in a group thread, and the group had 60 seconds to respond. People made sure to be ready for the drills by setting up multiple phones, turning up alert volumes to the highest level, and using a buddy system. However, if your buddy was missing during the drill, then you would also be held accountable. The purpose of the readiness drills, according to a former slave, was to build discipline, enhance responsiveness, and create a highly efficient communication network to disseminate information very quickly. Keith also co-founded a group called the Society of Protectors, a men's organization, and these drills had been used in that program for practical situations, such as responding to someone being kidnapped or going missing. However, in DOS, the focus was on maintaining discipline and being constantly ready, with little room for failure. It was more aggressive and less lenient, and its purpose was to build traits that Keith believed to be missing in women but present in men. In DOS, it was not acceptable to be unavailable for a long period of time, while in SOP, people could go dark or be unavailable for a certain period, such as at night or during family events. This constant pressure to be available 24/7 led to serious sleep deprivation. If they were late in responding, they would have to perform a penance, which involved doing something physically painful as punishment to motivate them and make sure that they don't fail the readiness drill the next time. Furthermore, masters would tell their slaves that they themselves would also be held accountable for their slaves' performance. For example, a master who was a direct slave of Keith's told her slaves that she would be paddled or put in a cage by her master if they failed their readiness drills. In DOS, members would paddle each other for failures, starting with readiness drills, but it later extended to any project or task that had not been completed. Members would take a photo of themselves naked, and the number of paddles they received would correspond to the number of failures. Keith would emphasize the importance of applying the paddles with enough force to cause pain, and would instruct members to flick their wrists a certain way to achieve this. Paddling was considered mandatory because of the vow of obedience, meaning members were expected to correct their failures, with paddling being one of the methods used to ensure that. Keith also once suggested the idea of setting up a BDSM dungeon with a cage in the basement. Once inside the cage, the person would stay in there until someone decided to let them out, with no clear timeline for how long they might be inside. Keith explained it as an exercise in surrender. A slave was worried about the humiliation that would come with it, like having to use the bathroom in the cage, and Keith said that this kind of humiliation was the point of surrender. One of the more extreme practices within DOS was the branding of members. Many individuals were branded in their pubic regions with a cauterizing pen, which would later create a third-degree burn and a scar. The procedure was extremely painful, and Lauren Salzman described it as the most painful thing she had ever experienced. The first step of the branding ceremony was taking a naked picture of everyone involved, and then the person being branded would say that they're making the vow of obedience to the master, that they're surrendering their body, property, and everything. Afterwards, the stencil would be placed on the slave being branded. The person being branded would be moved to a room with a massage table, and then kneel and say, "Master, please brand me. It would be an honor that I want to wear for the rest of my life." The slave would then lay on the table, and the rest of the slaves would hold her down to get branded, while one of the slaves would film the event. The actual burning only took a few minutes, but the entire process would last about 30 to 45 minutes. Following the branding ceremony, the masters told the slaves that the videos and photos taken during the branding process were additional forms of collateral. The slaves were told that the brand was meant to be a symbol, something abstract, and that it represented elements like air, earth, water, and fire. However, it was later discovered that the brand contained the letters KAR, which stands for Keith Alan Raniere. Keith admitted that the branding was a form of tribute to him. The first-line slaves' brands looked different than the other slaves' brands because the initial brand made it obvious that it was Keith's initials, so they had the brand reversed and put upside down to conceal the initials.
Do you have a piece of paper? A pencil? Run! Hurry! Back! Faster! Well, the monogram as it is right now is very directly related to my initials.
Is the brand the same one going to be done in every single person that participates in
Yes.
us? The same?
Yes. So I was sort of thinking of it like this.
Yeah, with the triangle and like a graph, and like it's a cool kind of alien symbol. I think it's cool.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
I mean, you can interpret it as a KI, but you can say like, no, it's not. You know.
Or K, it's actually KAR.
I like that a lot.
This is an order, this isn't a democracy.
Keith posed deeply unsettling hypotheticals questioning the morality of incest and rape. He went so far as to tell one DOS slave that incest could be acceptable if the victim found it pleasurable, and he even suggested that gang rape might not be wrong if the person being assaulted experienced orgasm. It was taught in SOP, the men's organization, that women lacked character, are impulsive, and cannot uphold their words. The SOP Complete program was introduced as a way to teach women character and correct this behavior. This program operated on the disturbing principle of humiliating women to eliminate what he claimed were inherent weaknesses that he taught were common in women. For instance, women in these classes were made to wear fake cow udders over their breasts while being subjected to derogatory name-calling. Sylvie described the SOP Complete training as being extremely stressful and scary. Keith also had teachings about women and sex. The discussions focused on the idea that men were obsessed with sex and thought about it constantly, while women were described as materialistic, self-absorbed, narcissistic, out of touch with reality, and as only interested in acquiring material things. He would also say that women objectified men, and that women didn't want to be responsible for anything. He would suggest that it was natural for men to have multiple sexual partners, as this was considered a healthier and more natural behavior, while women were expected to be loyal to one man. If women disagreed, it was framed as being motivated by spite or some form of retribution. If a slave would get accused of committing an ethical breach, it meant that they had compromised their ideology or acted in a way that was unethical, lazy, or destructive. Keith once accused Lauren of an ethical breach after she refused a writing project and showed that she was upset about it in front of others. This really affected her, since she placed great importance on getting his approval. His approval was considered the most important thing to her, as she sought validation that she was a good person, and that she was upholding the principles shared within their community. After she was accused of the ethical breach, she cleared her schedule and stayed home. During this time, she wrote a detailed 7-page plan to analyze her behavior, acknowledge how it affected others, and address what she needed to do differently. Lauren would even check in with Keith before making decisions. She wanted to ensure that these decisions did not create any difficulties for him, and that he approved of them. For example, she would consult him before visiting her grandparents out of town, buying a house, planning work trips, or making medical decisions. He used this trust and her need for approval to manipulate her. Another example of an ethical breach involves DOS slave Siobhan. Siobhan and her wife wanted to have children, and they took steps to do so by undergoing fertility treatment with an anonymous donor. Keith expressed confusion over why she would choose an anonymous donor over him, saying that his children would receive a 50% discount on the children's educational program he created, which he believed was a benefit of using him as the donor. Siobhan's decision to have children with an anonymous donor led to her being told that she committed an ethical breach. Keith would use isolation to manipulate his followers. He encouraged them to move to his community in upstate New York, cutting them off from family and friends. If anyone spoke out against him, he would instruct his followers to sever ties with them, making them feel completely alone. He often preyed on vulnerable individuals, including people who were not U.S. citizens and couldn't legally work in the country. He used their legal status as leverage, threatening deportation to keep them under his control. A particularly disturbing example involves a Mexican family he recruited in the early 2000s. The parents were hoping their children could learn from Keith and follow his teachings, and instead of offering mentorship, Keith used his position to control, abuse, and sexually exploit the daughters. He even went as far as to turn the family members against each other to do it. It all started when Lauren was contacted by the father, who explained to her that his daughter Daniela was initially going to Switzerland to study abroad for the year. However, he wanted to discuss the possibility of her going to Albany instead to join their study program. Daniela's parents, Hector and Adriana, had attended at least one class before Daniela joined, and they were very enthusiastic about NXIVM and ESP. The family had 3 daughters, Daniela, Mariana, and Camilla, and a son, Adrian. They joined the NXIVM community between 2001 and 2003, though not all of them joined at the same time. Daniela was around 17 or 18 years old when she moved into the NXIVM community. Her older sister Mariana later joined her, followed by their parents, and then followed by her younger siblings Camilla and Adrian. After the family moved from Mexico, they first lived in an apartment in Cojos, a town near Clifton Park. Eventually, they moved to Clifton Park, specifically to Knox Woods, where several other people in the community lived. Camila was around 13 or 14 years old at the time she joined, and was the youngest of her sisters. Keith had a nickname for her, Virgin Camilla. He started sexually exploiting her at only 15 years old, when he was 45 years old. He took countless explicit photographs of her, alongside several other women and girls, which he kept in a folder on his computer, labeled his studies, his souvenirs. Over the years, he amassed hundreds more, all posed in the same way Camilla's were. Camilla's sister, Daniela, eventually developed a romantic interest in another man, and Keith saw it as an opportunity to punish her. Around 2010, Keith called Lauren about a plan. He explained that Daniela had several issues, including not working, stealing food from her family, gaining 40 pounds, and locking the family out of the house. Keith also described Daniela as having a manipulative personality with sociopathic traits, which, according to Keith, would need to be managed. He told Lauren that if she didn't deal with her, then she wouldn't be a good mom to their future kids. The plan was to give Daniela an ultimatum: either stay in her room until she developed an acceptable plan for how to improve her behavior, or go back to Mexico. He convinced her parents that Daniela had committed something heinous, an ethical breach, and insisted that she isolate herself to atone for it. Keith managed to turn her parents against her, to get them to agree to the punishment she had to endure. He manipulated them into believing that their daughter was a liar, that she had become uncontrollable, and that they were responsible for how she had turned out. He made them believe that his plan was a good option to address her issues. Although Daniela's parents seemed sad and ashamed of their participation in the plan, they were still willing to move forward with it. Before presenting the plan to Daniela, Keith spoke with Lauren, and he told her that the family was concerned that Daniela might extend her time in the room, or view it as a type of vacation. To prevent this, the plan was to make the room as uncomfortable as possible, removing anything that could make her stay more comfortable. The room would only have a mattress on the floor, papers, and a pen or pencil for writing. Daniela would not be allowed to leave until she met the conditions set out for her. Keith initially told Lauren that Daniela would stay in the room for about a weekend, with the possibility of extending it to a week or 10 days. Although this punishment started as a short period of isolation, it eventually stretched into weeks, then months, and eventually years. Her confinement was extended multiple times for various reasons, including a seemingly trivial incident where she cut her hair, which Keith considered an ethical breach. Danielle agreed to go into the room after her parents presented the option to her, and although she seemed sad about her decision, she didn't want to go back to Mexico. Daniela believed that if she went back to Mexico, she would lose contact with her family and their support. Though the door was technically unlocked, she felt trapped, because she was told that if she left, she'd be sent back to Mexico without her family and documents, and would therefore have no way of going back to New York. She also believed that leaving would endanger her family. Daniela was given food 3 times a day, and she could request food from her family members. She could communicate with her family through notes, but they initially said they wouldn't communicate with her. Some family members later broke this rule. Daniela was only allowed to leave the room to go to the bathroom, which she shared with her family. If she wanted to leave the room for any other reason, she would have to go back to Mexico. During her time in the room, Daniela had minimal human contact, and initially she only interacted with Lauren. Later she had some contact with her siblings, but only toward the very end of her time there. As for her daily activities, Daniela wrote to Keith daily, sometimes multiple times a day. She wrote numerous letters to Keith, apologizing over and over again, telling him that she will be better. She wrote "I'm sorry" about 100 times, and continuously asked him if she had done enough to earn his forgiveness. But no matter how many times she expressed regret, it was never enough for Keith. During her period of isolation, Daniela exercised, cleaned her room and the shared bathroom, and spent time thinking. A lot of times she watched her sister from the window. There were moments when Daniela told Lauren she wasn't doing anything, and she struggled emotionally and physically during her time in the room. Sometimes she was more resolute about staying there, but it was clear that the experience was very difficult for her. When Daniela made proposals to fix her situation, Lauren would bring them to Keith. His responses varied, but he would often dismiss Daniela's proposals, saying that she was manipulating Lauren or trying to avoid what it really took to fix the situation. He described Daniela's feelings as temper tantrums or game playing. Daniela's mother was placed in a room next to her as a tactic by Keith. The goal was to make Daniela realize that her actions were affecting others, particularly her mother, and to care about the consequences of her behavior. At some point, Daniela requested medical care, as she needed to see a dentist due to a dental issue. Lauren approached Keith to ask if Daniela could go to the dentist, and Keith said he would think about it. It took 6 weeks for Keith to approve the request, and by that time, part of Daniela's tooth had broken off. During that 6-week period, Daniela would continuously express how much pain she was in. Eventually, Keith told Lauren that he was concerned Daniela might be sneaking out of her room. However, Lauren had no reason to believe that was happening. Keith instructed Lauren to call Daniela's brother Adrian to help install a security camera, and together, they went to the house to set it up. While Adrian handled the installation, Lauren spoke with Daniela in the room. Once the camera was set up, Adrian would check the footage and show Lauren some of it, and there was no evidence of Daniela leaving the room. Nearly 2 years after the start of her confinement, Daniela left the room. Camilla had called Lauren and told her that her sister has left the room and wanted to return to Mexico. Following that, Daniela's father, Hector, and Kristen Keefe, who was Keith's longtime partner and the mother of his first child, drove her to Mexico. Daniela had been given an assignment which required her to complete book reports within a set time frame in exchange for having her immigration documents sent to her, allowing her to return to the United States. Daniela was given approximately $200 by her father and was left with his accountant after crossing the border, who then drove her to a city of her choice. Initially, Hector had promised Daniela that he would support her as long as she completed the work required to return to the U.S. However, the plan changed, and eventually, her father stopped financially supporting her. She started sending emails to her father, expressing confusion and frustration, asking him why he is not supporting her anymore. She also mentioned in the emails that given her circumstances, she could not meet the requirements being imposed on her without the necessary documents, such as her passport and birth certificate, which were being withheld from her. She needed those documents to get a job and a place to live. Daniela's reports about her situation in Mexico were interpreted as excuses and lies by the group, with Daniela being accused of making up stories about her struggles. At one point, she had mentioned going to a festival, which the group jumped on as an example of her avoiding responsibility. Daniela spent a significant amount of time trying to get the paperwork she needed, but struggled to find the time to complete the book reports because she was too busy trying to survive. Nicole was a talented actress in her early 30s who started taking NXIVM classes back in 2015. Around 2016, she officially became Allison Mack's slave after providing the necessary collateral, including her credit card information, and fabricated damaging accusations against her own family members. During her time with the group, Nicole was living in Brooklyn. However, she was required to make weekly trips to Clifton Park, where Allison lived, and she would stay with her at her house. Over time, Nicole began receiving assignments that directly involved contact with Keith. One night, Allison received a text message from Keith, and she woke Nicole up in the middle of the night and told her to go and meet him. Nicole was told to tell him she would do anything he asked of her. Nicole complied, and when they met, Keith led her to a house across the street. There he asked her to remove all her clothes, and he then blindfolded her and guided her into a car, driving her around in a way that made her feel like he was trying to prevent her from knowing where they were going. Eventually, Keith led Nicole, who was still blindfolded, through a wooded area and into what she assumed was a shack. There, she was tied to a table, and another person who was in the room, whom Nicole didn't know, started performing oral on her as Keith circled the table making comments. Although she didn't want to participate, Nicole believed it was part of her commitment to DOS, and she feared that if she refused, her collateral could be used against her. Eventually, it was discovered that the third person in that room was actually Camilla, the same girl who had been victimized by Keith when she was just 15. The very same girl Keith had robbed of her innocence had now grown up, and he used her to victimize other people. If anyone dared to speak out against him publicly, Keith fought back. He kept track of his enemies, secretly monitoring their emails and even hiring private investigators to dig into their lives. He filed criminal complaints to silence victims and used lawsuits to intimidate anyone who challenged him. Within his community, he was untouchable. His followers carried out his every command, doing everything from cooking his meals to paying his bills and helping him commit unspeakable crimes. In 2008, 9 members of the NXIVM community, including Barbara Boucher and Susan Dones, left the organization due to concerns about how Keith ran things. They were disturbed by his sexual relationships with the other members, and there were also issues over money that was owed to them. Keith explained their departure by claiming that these women were criminals and philosophically socialist. They were labeled as enemies of the company and Keith, and they were referred to as suppressive, a term used within the organization to describe individuals who were seen as bad or evil, suppressing the goodness of the human spirit, and who were considered a threat to the organization's philosophy, or who acted in opposition to its beliefs. Defectors was another term used to refer to those who left. The issue of money owed to the women who left was characterized within the organization as extortion. NXIVM members were told that these women were attempting to extort money that they were not entitled to. Civil actions were filed against some of the defectors, with Barbara Boucher being one of the individuals named. Keith once gave Nicole a task which required her to befriend and gather information on a member of the NXIVM community who had been ostracized. As part of this assignment, Keith asked Nicole to create a fake social media profile and eventually meet this individual in person. She would be constantly reminded that if she didn't do as she was told, her collateral would be released. Around May 2017, a DOS slave, who was also a high-ranking member of NXIVM, publicly left the organization, and around the same time, a blog called The Frank Report started publishing articles that exposed DOS. One specific story was about the women being beaten with paddles. As NXIVMs learned about the existence of DOS, several of them began to leave as well, including some from the executive board. Around October 2017, the New York Times published an article exposing DOS, and in response to the article, Keith released a statement on the NXIVM website and also held a community meeting. He denied any association with DOS and claimed that he knew little about it. He said, quote, "I feel it is important to clarify the sorority is not part of NXIVM, and that I am not associated with the group." He also stated that although some of its activities could be considered racy and alternative, he believed they were good and essential. After leaving the group, some of the women who had been involved with DOS received cease and desist letters from a Mexican attorney. It was later uncovered through emails between Keith and Claire Bronfman that they were the ones who sent these letters. Additionally, Claire attempted to press criminal charges against a former DOS member who had shared her story with the media. Following the New York Times article's release, the government began interviewing witnesses and victims in November 2017. Keith then took a flight to Mexico with an heiress who was a major financial supporter of NXIVM and also a member of NXIVM's executive board. After a warrant was issued for his arrest, the government worked with Mexican immigration officials for more than a month and a half to track him down. Lauren Salzman and others, including some of their friends and families, had joined him in Mexico, traveling to Chicala, a small fishing village about an hour and a half outside of Puerto Vallarta. The group stayed at a luxury villa, which was part of a gated community, where weekly rentals could cost upwards of $10,000. Lauren claimed that the focus of the trip was on marketing and enrollment strategies for NXIVM, considering that much of the company has been destroyed. A week before Easter, most of the people on the trip left. However, Lauren and 4 other women, including Allison, stayed behind for a recommitment ceremony. Initially, they were in separate houses. However, the group eventually moved into one house with Keith. On March 26, 2018, Keith asked Lauren if she wanted to take a nap with him because he wasn't feeling well. They laid down and napped together, and after waking up, Keith still wasn't feeling well. He asked her to bring him some food, so she went to the kitchen to do so. While she was preparing a smoothie for herself, another woman ran into the kitchen and told her that the police were at the door, coming for Keith. Lauren immediately ran to Keith's room, locked them in, and tried to protect him. She wanted him to escape through a window, but he didn't want to do that. Keith asked her to call a mutual friend, Jack Levy, but she didn't know how to use his phone. In a state of panic, she went into protect Keith mode, locking all doors and blinds in the room. She could see outside the window that federal police, some wearing masks and bulletproof vests, were surrounding the property. The police conducted a thorough search of the property, but they didn't search the room Lauren and Keith were in at that point. Eventually, the police knocked on their door, and Keith was going to move into another room resembling a walk-in closet. Keith told Lauren to ask the police if they had a warrant, and he then went into the other room. When she asked the police if they had a warrant, they responded that they would show it to her if she opened the door, but she insisted they show it first. The police kept asking if anyone else was with her and if they had weapons. She thought the situation could escalate and that the police might shoot through the door, so she kept walking away from the door but still kept talking to the officers. The police eventually kicked down the door, and Lauren was forced to the floor at gunpoint, with 4 machine guns aimed at her. They continued to ask if anyone else was there, but she didn't respond. She feared that the police would become more aggressive, and at that moment, she called out Keith's name. Keith, who was in the other room, came out just as the police were attempting to break down the door on the other side. The police then restrained him, put him on the floor, and handcuffed him. After they allowed him to stand, Keith called out to Lauren, telling her that he was being accused of sex trafficking and mentioned that the charges were coming from the Eastern District of New York. After Keith was taken into custody, the women who were with him at the house started chasing the car he was being transported in, speeding alongside it in their own car. On the same day, Keith was deported to the United States, where he was arrested in connection with his involvement in DOS. On the same day that Keith was arrested, FBI Special Agent Michael Lever submitted an affidavit to search his residence at 8 Hale Drive in Half Moon, New York, which was approved by Judge Daniel J. Stewart. The agents discovered a series of photographs that were taken and stored on a computer device dating back to 2005. The images depict a minor who later became a first-line slave within DOS. The explicit images show her in extremely compromising poses that closely resemble those found in the collateral photographs of other DOS members. On April 19, 2018, a grand jury returned an indictment charging Keith and actress Allison Mack with sex trafficking, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, and conspiracy to commit forced labor. On June 5, 2018, Keith filed a motion requesting bail, proposing a series of strict conditions in exchange for his release before trial. He offered to sign a $10 million bond, agreed to stay within certain areas of New York, and to surrender his passport. Additionally, he proposed living under the supervision of a private security firm, with GPS tracking and constant armed guards supervising him. He proposed having access to a computer with only access to case-related material, and access to a phone to make calls with approved contacts from the government. Although Keith portrayed himself as a renunciate, this couldn't be further from the truth. Over the years, he has profited from operating pyramid schemes, with significant financial backing from wealthy women. Most notably, Claire Bronfman has financially supported him on multiple occasions, pouring millions into his ventures and even paying for private jet flights that cost up to $65,000 per trip. Claire also took care of the legal fees for lawsuits filed against NXIVM critics. She owns a private island in Fiji, which Keith has visited, and together, they have a global network of contacts. Keith didn't keep money under his own name, and he didn't even have a driver's license. Instead, he used a credit card registered to Pamela Caffritz, who passed away in 2016. For a year and a half up until that point, Keith had accessed hundreds of thousands of dollars from a bank account linked to Pamela, which held more than $8 million. Based on these facts, and despite the strict conditions Keith had proposed, the court denied his bail request, citing concerns about the risk of him fleeing, obstructing justice, or further exploiting women if released. Keith's trial began on May 7, 2019. The government relied heavily on the testimony of Lauren Salzman, and as the sole cooperating witness, her account became central to the prosecution's case. She pled guilty to racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion under a cooperation agreement with the government. Specifically, she admitted to crimes related to harboring and trafficking Daniela, forced labor, extortion, and wire fraud, and was facing up to 20 years in prison. In exchange for her truthful testimony against Keith, the government would inform the sentencing judge of her cooperation, though they wouldn't be making a recommendation on her sentence. Lauren ended up being sentenced to probation. The defense made the argument that while Keith's actions were unconventional and offensive to many, he and his followers genuinely thought they were helping people overcome personal obstacles. Keith didn't deny the existence of DOS, nor did he dispute that members were required to provide collateral to join. He also didn't deny that several members of DOS were branded as part of their initiation. However, he tried to distance himself from the organization, arguing that DOS was not formally connected to NXIVM. He claimed that DOS members joined voluntarily, provided collateral willingly, and agreed to be branded, all without coercion. He also contended that the collateral wasn't tied to any sexual acts with him or others, and that the collateral was never actually released. Keith Raniere's trial ended on June 19, 2019, and after weeks of proceedings, he was sentenced on October 27, 2020. Keith was found guilty of 4 acts of conspiracy to commit identity theft, 2 acts of identity theft, conspiracy to unlawfully possess an identification document, 2 acts of sexual exploitation of a child, possession of CP, conspiracy to alter records for use in an official proceeding, trafficking for labor and services, document servitude, extortion, sex trafficking, and forced labor. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Nancy Salzman eventually pleaded guilty to charges of racketeering conspiracy and was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison on September 8, 2022. Allison Mack pleaded guilty to charges of racketeering conspiracy and racketeering in 2019. She faced up to 14 years in prison, but was sentenced to only 3 years on June 30, 2021. During her sentencing, she addressed the victims, saying, quote, "Sorry I ever exposed you to the nefarious and emotionally abusive schemes of a twisted man." Claire Bronfman pleaded guilty to conspiracy to conceal and harbor aliens for financial gain and fraudulent use of personal identification information in April 2019. She was sentenced to 81 months in prison on September 30, 2020. There have been several deaths tied to Keith and NXIVM that have raised suspicion due to the circumstances surrounding them. In 1984, Keith, who was 24 years old, became involved with a 15-year-old girl, Gina Melita, after meeting her through a theater group. He manipulated and abused her, and when their relationship ended, Gina Melita introduced him to her 14-year-old friend, Gina Hutchinson, whom he also took advantage of. When Gina Hutchinson's sister, Heidi, found Keith climbing into her sister's window, he told her that Gina Hutchinson was meant to be with him, claiming she was a Buddhist goddess. In the years that followed, Gina Hutchinson dropped out of school and continued her relationship with Keith. Sadly, in 2002, she was found dead of a gunshot wound at a Buddhist monastery. While officially ruled a suicide, some people close to the case, including former NXIVM publicist Frank Parlato, have suggested that Keith's influence over her, including his past conversations about suicide, may have played a role in her death. Keith would send Gina images of suicide and would sometimes ask her, "Is suicide always wrong? When could it be the right thing to do?" Allegedly, after Keith learned that Gina had another boyfriend, he reportedly said she must ascend to the level of the goddess by leaving her body. In 2002, Kristen Snyder, a 35-year-old environmental consultant, took a NXIVM course in Anchorage, Alaska. She later traveled to Albany to meet Keith and other NXIVM leaders, becoming increasingly influenced by them. In early 2003, she claimed that she was pregnant with Keith's child, and after attending another NXIVM seminar, Kristen disappeared. 2 days later, her car was found in Seward, Alaska, with a disturbing note inside. The note said, quote, "I attended a course called Executive Success Programs based out of Anchorage, Alaska, and Albany, New York. I was brainwashed and my emotional center of the brain was killed/turned off. I still have feeling in my external skin, but my internal organs are rotting. I am sorry, life. I didn't know I was already dead. May we persist into the future." Her disappearance remains a mystery, with some reports suggesting that Keith paid $24,000 in an attempt to access her email account after she vanished. Thank you for watching.